Hello everybody, this is Carbon Killed the Cat, and welcome to your third Lua 5.2 tutorial. In this video, we'll be going over conditionals and logic statements, so let's get started. So, conditionals and logic statements are very important to programming. They allow your code to go in different directions depending on the values of one or more variables. And what a logic statement is it's some combination of expressions that either gives you true or false. So it gives you a Boolean value, like we went over in the last video. If you don't remember, Boolean values are the values that can only be true or false. So a logic statement gives you one of those. If the statement is true, it gives you the true value. If the statement is false, then it gives you the false value. And conditionals use logic statements to either take the code in one direction if the logic statement evaluates to true, or take the code in another direction if the logic statement evaluates to false. So there are multiple different ways to use logic statements and conditionals, so let's get into that now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to learn a bit more about operators. So we'll use the plus operator since we already know how that one works. So you know that the plus operator takes a variable on either side of it. We'll call them A and B for now. And these two variables on either side are called operands. Don't get operator and operands confused, they're very similar words. So what the operator does is it takes the two operands and then it returns the value of those two operands added together. And return just means gives back. So if we were to say C equals A plus B, then C would take the return value of the plus operator acting on A and B. So we'll learn more about returning in the functions tutorial, but just know that it kind of means gives out. So again, the plus operator takes the A and B operands and adds them together. And to put it in a general sense, an operator takes in some number of operands, performs an operation on them, and then returns that operation. So this also works for any of the other operators we learned. Multiplication takes the A and B operands, returns A times B. And all the other ones divided by modulo subtract. And any operator that has one operand on each side, these are called binary operators. Lua also has unary operators, which only take one operand. An example of this is the negate operator. So you have the negate operator and A. And what this operator does is it takes the operand to the right of it, and it just returns the negated value of that operand. So if we were to replace this with 3, it would return -3. Some languages also have ternary operators. Lua doesn't have these, so we're not going to go into them. So now I'm going to list all of the operators in Lua in order of precedence, and we're going to skim over a few because we won't be able to use them until later tutorials, but it is important to know a little bit about them for this tutorial. And what I mean by order of precedence is kind of like order of operations in math, where you do parentheses, then you do exponents, multiplication, division, subtraction, or then addition, then subtraction. This is a very expanded version of that. So the first operator, I'm also going to include the operands for the operator. The first operator is A to the power of B. And I probably should have included this with the math operators, but it goes just as well here. So this operator is always done first, unless you have parentheses. So I guess I should add parentheses first. And you can use parentheses just like you can in an equation in math. It just causes those operations to be evaluated first. But back to the exponential operator. This just takes the operand A and raises it to the power of B and returns that value. The next operator is the not operator. So this is the first logical operator we've really gone over, and this just inverts it inverts the Boolean value of A. So if A is true, then it returns false. If A is false, then it returns true. And we'll get more into what is true and what is false later, because all values are either true or false, they don't have to be Boolean. The next operator is the size of operator. And this operator returns the size of a string or a table. And in a string, it's the number of characters in the string. In a table, it's the number of elements in the table. And we'll get into that in 2 tutorials. The next operator is the negate operator. We just went over that. And as I said, it just negates A numerically, so 1 would become -1 and vice versa. Next is the multiplication operator, or whoops, I need the operands. The multiplication operator, we know how this works, A times B. Then there's the division operator. We went over this also in the last tutorial, A divided by B. Then the modulo operator, A modulo B, or is it B? Then addition, A plus B. Subtraction, A minus B. And then there's the concatenation operator, A concatenated with B. And again, this just returns the string A squished together with the string B. So after that, there are the relational operators. The first one is less than. I need the operands again. So A is less than B returns a Boolean value, and it returns true if A is less than B, and it returns false if A is greater than B. And then there's the opposite of that. A is greater than B. And this, again, does the opposite. If A is greater than B, it returns true. If A is less than B, it returns false. And then there's A is less than or equal to B. This does the same thing as A is less than B, but also it also returns true if A is equal to B. And then, you may be able to guess, there's A is greater than equal to B. And again, this returns true if A is greater than or equal to B, and returns false if A is less than B. After that, there is the not equals to operator, which is the tilde and equals. I need the operands. So A does not equal B. This also returns a Boolean value. It returns true if A doesn't equal B, and returns false if A equals B. Then there's the relational equals operator. This is different than the assignment equals operator from the last video. And this does the opposite of the not equals operator. It returns true if A is equal to B, and returns false if A is not equal to B. And do not, see, this is a double equal sign. Do not get this confused with the assignment equals operator, which is a single equal sign. That will cause a very bad error in the code. Next is the AND operator. And this is a more confusing one. What this does is if A is false, then it returns A. Or if A is true, then it returns B. So this is confusing. You'll understand it a bit better later when we go into logic statements. And finally, there is the OR operator. And this does the opposite of the AND operator. If A is true, then it returns A. If A is false, then it returns B. So these are all of the operators in Lua. And as I said, they're either unary, like the size of and negate operator, and also the not operator, or they're binary, like all the math operators, the relational operators, and the logical operators, like A and B, or actually no, not A is not binary, but yep, they're either binary or unary. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to use these operators in logic statements. So the first thing we're going to do with logical statements is we're going to use them on their own, and then we'll use them in if statements. So on their own, logic statements can be used to assign variables or to be passed into a function, like our print function. So let's assign a few variables. We'll say A is 10 and B is 20. So now let's print. We'll say A and B. So if we run this, then we get 20. And we get 20 because the AND operator returns the first operand if that operand is false, and returns the second operand if the first operand is true. So the A operand was true, so it returned the second operand B, and the value of B is 20. So if we change this to the OR operator, and the OR operator returns the first operand if that operand is true, and the second operand if the first operand is false. So if we run this, we get 10 because the A operand is true and its value is 10. And before we move on, I should probably go over what exactly counts as true and what exactly counts as false. So in Lua, any value besides the Boolean value false and nil is considered true. Even 0 and empty string, some languages have 0 and empty string be false, but in Lua they're true. So for a variable, for any value to be evaluated as false, it must be the Boolean value false or nil. So both of these variables are considered true because they are neither of those. So this is a simple logic statement. We can get more advanced, so we can say A is less than B, or say this statement is false. So remember that the less than operator and all the other comparison operators, any of these, they all return Boolean values. So they will return either true or false. And the less than operator returns true if A is less than B and false otherwise. So we're using this combined with the OR statement to say if A is less than B, return true, or return the string this statement is false. So if we run this, we get true in the console. But if we were to change the comparison operator to greater than, it's saying if A is greater than B, then return true, or return this statement is false. And if we run this, we get this statement is false because A is not greater than B. So we can make this even more complicated by saying if A plus 11 is greater than B, and if we run this, we get true because A plus 11 is 21, and that is greater than B, which is 20. So the OR operator will return this first value because it comes out to true. So now we're using all of the different kinds of operators here. We're using the math operators, we're using the plus operator. Then we have the comparison operator, we're using the greater than operator. And also just the logical operators, the and, slash, or, slash, not. In this case, we're using or. So we can also use the not operator here. We can say not, put the space in the wrong place. We can say not A is greater than B, or print this statement is false. So what this is saying is if A is greater than B is false, so remember the not operator inverts whatever value it's being used with, so it's being used with the statement A is greater than B because we have the parentheses here. And so it's saying if this is false, then it will return true, and if this is true, then it will return false. It inverts it. So now we're saying if A is greater than B is false, then return that value. Otherwise, output this statement is false. But in this case, it should be the statement is true. So if we run this, we get this statement is true because A plus 11 is greater than B, so that would return true, and then the not operator would invert that to false. So then the OR operator would return this value instead of the first. And I'm also using parentheses here because remember the not operator takes precedence over any operator besides the exponential operator. So we have to use parentheses to tell the Lua that we want to say, we want to use the not operator on this entire statement, A plus 11 is greater than B, and we don't want to use the not operator on just A, because if we didn't have parentheses, that's what would happen, and that would cause an error because not A plus 11 doesn't work, because A would turn into the Boolean value false, and you can't add 11 to false. So you have to make sure you put the parentheses in the right place. Remember that all of these are in order, so if any operator, if one operator comes before the other, that operator will be evaluated first. So it's like order of operations in math, but a little more complicated. So this is a very complicated logical operator, or not very complicated, but it's pretty complicated. It uses all of the different types of operators at least once, and it ends up saying something that you could actually use. You could say, if this statement is false, then return something else. So this is one way to use logical operators, and the other way to use them is in if statements. So an if statement allows you to execute one block of code if a logical statement evaluates to true, and it allows you to execute a different block of code if that statement evaluates to false. So let's create an if statement. So you say if, and then you say your condition. So let's just say something that's obviously true. So we'll say 10 is greater than 5. And then you write then. So this kind of works out to be a sentence. You say if 10 is greater than 5, then, and then you have your block of code here, and after your block of code you write end. So in between these two lines, the if line and the end line, this needs to go back down one, this is where you write your code that will only be executed if 10 is greater than 5, which is obviously true. So we'll just print this statement. It's not how you spell statement. Statement is true. So again, this works out to a sentence. If 10 is greater than 5, then print this statement is true and end. So if we run this, the console outputs this statement is true. But if we swap the operator here and then run it again, we get nothing. The program doesn't output anything, and this line of code is skipped completely. So another thing you can do with if statements is add an else block. So an else block is saying that if this first statement evaluates to false, then it should run this whatever block of code comes under this else statement instead. So it doesn't take a logical statement. It's just saying if 10 is less than 5, then print this statement is true. Otherwise, run this block of code, and we'll just print this statement as false. So if we run this, we get this statement is false, and if we change this back to 10 is greater than 5, then it prints this statement is true. So what an if statement is doing internally is it's running the logic statement, and if it evaluates to any true value, so it can be either the Boolean value true or anything besides false and nil, if the value comes out to be that, then it will run this block of code, and if the logic statement evaluates to false, it will run the other block of code. So there's one more block you can add to an if statement. There is an else if block. So what an else if block is saying is, or what this entire if statement will be saying is, if this statement is true, then run this line of code, or if this statement is true, and we'll write a statement here, then run whatever code comes under this statement. Otherwise, just output this, or just run this code. So let's say if 10 is greater than, we'll say if 10 is greater than 5, and we already have that. Let's come up with something else. We'll say if 20 is greater than 15. So these are all just logical statements that I can easily change between true and false. So here we'll print the second statement is true. So this entire if statement still can be read out as a sentence. So we're saying if 10 is greater than 5, then run this code. Or if 20 is greater than 15, then run this code. Otherwise, run this code. So if we run this, we get this statement is true, but if we swap this so that this first statement will be false, then the console outputs the second statement is true. And if this becomes false as well, then it outputs this statement as false. And you can have as many else if blocks as you want. So you can say else if 30 is greater than 25, then print the third statement is true. Third statement is true. So now it outputs the third statement is true because the first logical statement evaluates to false, so this code is ignored. And the second logic statement evaluates to false, so this code is ignored. but this logic statement evaluates to true, so this code is run. And then the else block is skipped because it already found a true statement. But again, if we change this to false, then it will run this statement as false. And you can have any logical statement here. It can be as simple as this, though you probably would want something that wouldn't always evaluate to either true or false. You want to have some kind of variable that can change. So you can have something as simple as this, or something as complicated as we had before with using every different kind of logical operator there is, and they can be as long as they want, as long as in the end it evaluates to either true or false, which it always will in Lua. So this is an if statement, and these are very powerful. They allow you to change the path of your programming, so you can say if some statement is true, then take the program this way, or if the second statement is true, take the program this way, and otherwise do something else. So, as an example of something you can do with it, we're going to learn a new function called type. And what the type function does is it gets the type of a variable and returns it as a string. So we can say print type, and we'll just say 20. So you see we're calling the print function, and as the parameter to the print function, we're calling the type function. So that's why we have the nested parentheses here. So if we run this, we get the string number output in the console. So the type of the value 20 is number, and this would also work if we said x equals 20, and we did the type of x. Type of x. This would still output number, or we could change x to a string, and it would output string. You could change it to a bool, not bool, true. Change it to true, and it would output boolean, and so on. You could use it with tables or any of the other variable types we learned in the last tutorial. So we're going to use this as an if statement. We'll call this test variable to name our variables properly and use descriptive names. We'll say test var equals 10. So now let's create an if statement that will check the type of test var and will output the type of it along with some other kind of message. So let's say if the type of test var is equal to, and remember to use the double equal signs because the single equal sign is the assignment operator here, and the double equal signs are the comparison equals operator. So if the type of test var equals number, then print test, we need a string, test var is a number. And then we can say else if the type of test var is a string, then we print test var is a string, and we can go through all the other types, but that's unnecessary, so we'll just say else we print test var, not very good at typing today, test var is something else. And remember to always have end. And just a side note, the then and end, in most languages this is replaced with these curly brackets, but this is just the way Lua does it, and it can make things a bit less clear than if the Lua just used curly brackets, but it's still okay. So remember to have then at the end of the if line, so after your logical statement, write then, and at the very end of the entire if statement, after all the else ifs and elses, or actually there can only be one else, so after the entire if statement, remember to have the end as the last line. So what we're saying here is if the type of test var is number, then print the message that test var is a number. Or if the type of test var is a string, then print the message that test var is a string, and otherwise just say that test var is something else. So if we run this, we get test var as a number, or we can change it to a string. We can even have it be empty string. And we get test var as a string, and then we can set test var to a boolean, and we get test var as something else. So this is something that you could actually end up using a lot, and even more when we get to functions, because the way Lua works with variables, a variable can be whatever type you want, like we said in the last tutorial, and it can also change types through the program. So it's legal to say test var equals 10, and in the next line we can say test var equals empty string. And if we did this, it would output test var as a string, because test var was a number, but then we changed it to a string. And this is illegal in most languages, but in Lua it's perfectly legal. It's one of the defining points of Lua that makes it such a great language. And they do handle it very well, even though it's possibly unsafe. But this is a very useful if statement to know, because you can check the type of a variable and have your code do different things depending on what type the variable is. So you'll end up using this a lot, and you'll end up using if statements in general a lot. They're one of the main building blocks of programming. So make sure you know this, and make sure you know how to use logic statements properly. Try to remember what all of these different operators do, and I wouldn't say remember their order of precedence, but maybe write it down in a list somewhere. Just copy this list we have here, copy it somewhere so that you can go back and check, for example, whether the multiplication operator comes before the less than or equal to operator. So again, just make sure you know all of this. If you didn't understand something, then go over the tutorial again, or at least the part that you didn't understand, because the logic statements can be difficult to understand, I know. So make sure you understand it before you move on to the next tutorial. But that's all for this video, and in the next video we'll be going over loops. So see you then.